They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
Step straight into the concrete canyons of New York, where the city's skyline was being built on a foundation of massive underworld extortion. The most compelling evidence of the Mafia's staggering money-making prowess was cemented in a racket known as the Concrete Club. Over a 4-year period, the governors of 3 crime families and the late Paul Castellano ripped off at least $1.27 million from 13 major building projects. The mechanics of the extortion were ruthless and simple. Ralph Scopo, a Colombo soldier who doubled as the president of the Concrete Workers Union, served as the mob's bagman. He approached contractors like James Costigan, president of XLO Concrete Corporation, laying down a law: pay a 2% kickback on every gross contract, or face unparalleled union miseries. When another contractor, Anthony D'Ambrosi, questioned the system, Scopo brutally explained that any job over $2 million belonged to the club, and the 2-point payoff had to be put in ahead of time. Even worse, Scopo informed him that on projects not covered by the club, separate bribes to him for labor peace were absolutely mandatory. But the FBI's hidden microphones captured more than just the mechanics of extortion. They recorded the raw, palpable paranoia of the mob's own foot soldiers. Scopo, the very man enforcing the commission's will on the streets, was terrified of his own bosses. In a chilling, taped conversation with Costigan, Scopo admitted he was afraid that if he got indicted, the godfathers might suspect he would turn rat to save himself. Pointing to the recent murders of a corrupt carpenters union leader, Theodore Maritas, and the sadistic Gambino hitman Roy DeMeo, Scopo explained that the bosses didn't take chances. They figure, maybe this guy under pressure, he'll rat. Scopo fretted on tape, noting that the bosses would have him killed just to be safe. He knew that despite a lifetime of making the bosses rich, a single seed of doubt could mean he would simply vanish. While their soldiers sweated bullets, the godfathers were captured on tape endlessly squabbling over their mountains of cash. Paul Castellano was recorded complaining to Genovese soldier Louis Giardina that Century Maxim, a contractor supposedly part of the club, was acting funny and raiding everybody's jobs. Meanwhile, in his East Harlem headquarters, Fat Tony Salerno was totally bewildered by a high finance lesson from his minion Louis DiNapoli regarding a $200,000 payoff split involving Castellano and a Century Maxim executive. The greed at the top was staggering. Lucchese underboss Salvatore Tom Mix Santoro delighted in stirring up bad blood, proudly recounting how he steamed Fat Tony up by revealing that Castellano had secretly pocketed $500,000 for selling certified ready-mix. When an irate Salerno demanded answers from his own construction specialist, Vincent DiNapoli, Santoro gleefully noted that DiNapoli was reprimanded for thinking it wasn't his business to report the score. And nothing illustrated the sheer avarice of the godfathers better than a bugged conversation where Lucchese capo Sal Avellino told his boss, Tony Dux Corallo, that Castellano had actually whined about a union payoff dropping to $25,000, calling a previous $200,000 yearly kickback just a bone. Corallo was astounded by Big Paul's greed, exclaiming on tape, "Imagine that, he didn't get enough money?" When the government finally hauled the Mafia dignitaries into federal court, the trial turned into an unprecedented spectacle. In a surreal twist, Carmine the Snake Persico, the ruthless boss of the Colombo family, decided to act as his own lawyer. Dressed in conservative suits and gold-rimmed glasses, Persico looked the part, but his folksy Brooklyn accent and amateurish blunders devastated the defense's strategy. While cross-examining Stanley Sternshose, a concrete club contractor, Persico bumbled into getting the witness to admit he had missed making his required payoffs to Scopo, inadvertently cementing the prosecution's extortion charges. He also disastrously cross-examined Joe Cantalupo by bringing up a loan-sharking beating administered by Persico's own brother, further painting himself as a vindictive hoodlum to the jury. The psychological toll of the trial weighed heavily on the aging bosses. Held without bail, the usually stoic Fat Tony Salerno seemed more concerned with his stomach than the impending verdict, munching constantly on cookies and even pleading with Judge Richard Owen for a hot lunch instead of the cold sandwiches provided to prisoners. Prosecutor Michael Chertoff delivered a lethal closing argument, using the testimony of defectors to strip away the mob's insulation and declaring that the Mafia's sole purpose was people banding together in an organized and disciplined fashion for one purpose: to commit crimes. After the jury spent 5 days deliberating and reviewing tapes, including one where Corallo and Salerno casually discussed murdering a crippled soldier, the verdict was absolute annihilation. The jury forewoman spent 28 minutes reading guilty on 151 counts against the 8 defendants. As the gavel came down on century-long sentences, the mobsters remained defiant to the bitter end. The Lucchese underboss, Tom Santoro, sarcastically urged the judge to hurry up, snapping, "Ah, give me the 100 years. I'll go inside now." And Fat Tony Salerno, facing the reality of dying in a cage, later sent a sardonic message to the victorious prosecutor through a police sergeant. "You tell that son of a bitch he owes me a thank you note." The commission trial verdicts came down like a thunderbolt, and everyone in law enforcement was popping champagne, thinking they had just heard the death knell of the American Mafia. They thought the concrete club was smashed, the godfathers were caged, and the legendary commission was dissolved. But if you think the mob just packed up and went home, you don't know the underworld. While the feds were patting themselves on the back, the families were already breeding a new generation of wise guys, hatching schemes that would make the old boss's head spin. Take the gasoline excise tax racket, a scam that siphoned a staggering $100 million a year right out from under the government's nose. The real inventors of this flimflam were the Russian Mafia Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union who set up shop in the Brighton Beach section of Brooklyn. They figured out a loophole in a New York state law meant to simplify gas tax collection by shifting the burden from retail stations to wholesale distributors. The Russians set up what they called daisy chains of dummy wholesale companies, passing fuel on paper from one shell corporation to another. The final company in the chain, a burn company headed by clueless patsies like a Polish immigrant named Mieczysław Misha Szepkowski, was supposed to pay the tax. But these front companies existed only on paper, and by the time the tax collectors came knocking, the patsies were usually out of the country and the Russians had pocketed the 30 cents a gallon tax. Of course, a racket that lucrative doesn't stay a secret for long, and soon enough, the Colombo crime family crashed the party. A brilliant, 30-something Colombo capo named Michael Franzese muscled his way into the operation, letting the Russians do all the heavy paperwork while he demanded a 75% cut of their profits. To give you an idea of the sheer scale of this heist, Franzese later confessed to receiving up to $9 million in cash every week, delivered in plain paper bags. At its peak, Franzese and his Colombo partners were hauling in $15 million a month just from bootlegging gasoline. But the mob didn't abandon its traditional concrete and steel stomping grounds, either. Just look at the dismantling of Manhattan's dilapidated West Side Highway. When the state awarded a $12 million demolition contract to the John P. Picone Company in the 1980s, the deal included the right to sell off the salvageable scrap. Enter Thomas J. Petrizzo, an executive who looked completely legitimate but was actually a high-ranking Colombo capo and the family's point man on a Mafia construction commission. Petrizzo lusted after the highway's 11,000 tons of valuable steel. He brokered a treacherous sweetheart deal with Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the fearsome coordinator for the Lucchese family. Petrizzo handed Casso a cool $800,000. In exchange, the Luccheses used their union stranglehold to ensure labor peace and allow Picone to use carpenters instead of higher-paid ironworkers for the demolition, drastically cutting costs and maximizing the mob's illicit profits from the steel salvage. It was a perfect, multi-family conspiracy. Meanwhile, the three convicted titans, Fat Tony Salerno, Tony Ducks Corallo, and Carmine the Snake Persico, sat in their cells, clinging to the faint hope that their life sentences would be overturned on appeal. But the true cost of their legacy was becoming undeniable. A devastating report spearheaded by Governor Mario Cuomo revealed that the Mafia's stranglehold on construction inflated overall building costs by at least 10% across the board. Mob syndicates guaranteed corrupt contractors that their bribes would ensure a reasonable payoff and prevent costly union strikes. And in the high-stakes world of New York real estate, where a single day's delay on a $100 million project added $75,000 in interest alone, developers gladly paid the mob's invisible tax rather than fight. Cuomo grimly noted that the corruption had become so habitual that society just took it for granted. The FBI's Thomas Scheer vowed to use RICO's civil provisions to obliterate the mob's grip on unions and businesses. But hardened veterans of the street, like NYPD Lieutenant Remo Franceschini, knew better. Franceschini warned that the five families were masters of adaptation. The new bosses would simply insulate themselves deeper, cut off direct contact with their underlings, and keep the money flowing. The old guard might be behind bars, but the underworld machine they built was far from finished. The gavels had barely fallen on the historic commission trial, and federal agents were busy patting themselves on the back, certain they had just dealt a death blow to the American Mafia. But out on the gritty streets of New York, the reality was terrifyingly different. The truth was, the mob's recuperative powers were staggering, and the underworld machine built by Lucky Luciano in 1931 was far from broken. Veteran street cops like NYPD Lieutenant Remo Franceschini knew the score. He warned that these crime families were absolute masters of adaptation. Sure, the old guard was rotting behind bars, but the new bosses simply insulated themselves deeper in the shadows, cutting off direct contact with their soldiers while the dirty money kept flowing. Part of this impenetrable armor was forged by the sheer, almost comical ignorance of the mob's lower ranks. The veil of secrecy was so thick that many street-level earners didn't even know who pulled their strings. Take William Butcher Boy Massily, a Bronx racketeer. The FBI had his office bugged and caught him reacting to a newspaper article that identified his Mafia supervisor. "Geez, I didn't know we belonged to the Genovese family," the bewildered hijacker confessed to a pal. The FBI even set up a cinematic sting operation in Little Italy, bankrolling a phony pasta importing company run by a turned-Bonanno associate named Vinny DePenta. The trap ensnared a Colombo enforcer named Frankie the Beast Falonga, who swaggered in and offered DePenta protection from the Bonanno barbarians in exchange for a piece of the pasta action. Falonga even took it upon himself to tutor the clueless DePenta on Mafia genealogy, trying in vain to explain that the old Profassi family and the Colombo family were one and the same. But while these street-level goons provided comic relief, their ignorance served a dark purpose. It perfectly shielded the capos and bosses from FBI scrutiny. Make no mistake, while the soldiers fumbled, the syndicate's money-making machine was ruthlessly efficient. The Mafia's lifeblood, loan sharking, was draining victims dry through straight vigorish, where missing a single weekly interest payment meant the debt compounded exponentially without ever reducing the principal. The Colombos were running a super Shylock operation, extorting $40,000 a week from terrified businessmen who were bluntly reminded of the underworld's golden rule: your body is the collateral. The five families were diversifying their portfolios with terrifying precision, carving up the city's economy into personal fiefdoms. The Gambinos were raking in cash from the sex industry, with capo Robert DiBernardo operating the area's largest pornography wholesale network and running a highly profitable Times Square striptease and video emporium. Over at the Fulton Fish Market, the Genovese family used brute force to dominate a $1 billion-a-year wholesale seafood center, extorting fishmongers and controlling the loading and unloading of every catch. Meanwhile, the Lucases had their hooks deep inside the air freight companies at JFK Airport, orchestrating massive cargo hijackings, including the legendary $5 million Lufthansa heist. Even the Bonanos, considered the smallest and weakest of the families, were hauling in millions. They infiltrated the newspaper deliverers union, orchestrating the daily theft of 10,000 copies of the New York Post right off the loading bays to resell for pure profit. The family's wily consigliere, Anthony Spiro, also flooded Brooklyn and Queens with illegal joker poker video gambling machines, splitting the illicit proceeds with local storefront owners. The sheer scale of this plunder was bleeding the city dry. Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau grimly concluded that the mob was skimming multi-millions annually, imposing an invisible, insidious tax on the entire region that drove up the cost of everything from housing to the clothes on people's backs. As the 1990s approached, a ruthless third generation of mafiosi was stepping up to take the reins, well aware of the legal traps that had doomed their predecessors. The government knew the stakes were astronomical. FBI commanders like William E. Durand publicly vowed to relentlessly pursue the new regimes, declaring, "Our mission is to reduce the families to the level of street gangs. We have no intention of pulling out now and giving them a chance to revive." It was a monumental turning point for the modern-era mafia, a brutal showdown to determine if the five families would be the saviors of their underworld dynasty or the architects of its absolute ruination. Step right into the blood-stained streets of Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens and Red Hook, where a young man born to middle-class comfort chose the life of an apex predator. His name was Carmine Joseph Persico, but in the treacherous, whispered corridors of the underworld, he was known by a moniker that sent shivers down the spines of his enemies, the Snake. Born on August 8, 1933, Persico didn't come from the desperate, grinding poverty that bred most mobsters of his era. His father, Carmine Sr., was a respectable legal stenographer for prestigious Manhattan law firms, bringing home a steady paycheck even during the darkest days of the Depression. His mother, Susan Plantamura, tried to keep a tight rein on Carmine and his siblings, But the allure of the local wise guys flashing fat bankrolls at the neighborhood storefront hangouts was a siren song he couldn't resist. At 16, over his parents' vehement objections, Persico dropped out of high school and hit the streets as a leader of the Garfield Boys, a vicious gang armed with knives, clubs, and homemade zip guns. By March 1951, at just 17 years old, he was arrested for the fatal beating of another youth during a savage brawl in Prospect Park. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident cemented his terrifying street reputation for absolute boldness. His raw audacity caught the eye of Frankie Sciazza-Battamarco, a capo in the Profassi crime family, who enlisted the skinny, 5'6" teenager into his bookmaking and loan sharking rings. Persico quickly graduated to burglaries and truck hijackings, rising through the ranks so rapidly that he earned his button as a made man in his mid-20s. He built a horrifying reputation for cold-blooded violence. On the morning of August 20, 1961, a police sergeant on a routine inspection accidentally stumbled into the darkened Sahara Club in South Brooklyn and found Persico and another man actively strangling mobster Larry Gallo with a rope. The attackers bolted past the cops, but when questioned, the half-dead Gallo adhered strictly to the Mafia code of omerta and refused to identify Persico, resulting in the assault charges being dropped. The Snake didn't operate alone in his criminal ascendance. He was constantly backed by his bodyguard and partner in crime, Hugh Apples McIntosh. McIntosh, towering at 6'5" and weighing 250 pounds, was a mountain of Irish muscle who couldn't be a made man due to his heritage, but his fierce loyalty to Persico made him a devastating weapon. Together, they orchestrated massive heists, like a 1959 truck hijacking of a $50,000 cargo of linen that ultimately led to federal indictments. Persico's crew ruthlessly extorted protection money from almost every illegitimate business in Bensonhurst and South Brooklyn, squeezing funeral parlors, restaurants, and catering halls. As one FBI informer later revealed, they routinely shook people down and instilled absolute fear in the community. Paroled in 1979 after serving a 12-year sentence, the 46-year-old Persico emerged to claim his throne as the undisputed godfather of what was now the Colombo crime family. He lived a life of stark, terrifying contrasts. On paper, he resided with his wife, Joyce, and their 4 children in a comfortable split-level home in the Long Island suburb of Hempstead. But his true empire was managed from the Nesta Social Club in Carroll Gardens, and he fortified his power at his sprawling 59-acre estate in upstate Saugerties, named the Blue Mountain Manor Horse Farm. Just to show you how dangerous this man was, a police raid at that farm uncovered an apocalyptic stockpile of some 50 rifles and 40 bombs. When the federal government launched its historic commission case to take down the heads of the New York families, Persico refused to surrender, going on the lam and hiding out for 3 months at the Long Island home of his brother-in-law, Fred DeChristopher. The arrogant Mafia don treated DeChristopher's house like his own personal resort, cooking his favorite pasta with olive oil and garlic while bragging that he had stashed enough illicit cash to last 10 lifetimes. He even casually boasted to his brother-in-law about his role in historic mob hits, whispering, "I killed Anastasia." But Persico's trust was lethally misplaced. DeChristopher was the informant who ultimately betrayed him to the FBI. On February 15, 1985, FBI agent Brian Taylor dialed DeChristopher's phone, telling the awakened boss that the house was surrounded. Unarmed, Persico marched out of the attic with his hands raised, captured alongside his capo Dominic Donnie Shax Montemarano. Always the arrogant showman, the Snake joked with the arresting agents during the ride to Manhattan and even cordially autographed his own face on an FBI Most Wanted poster. Persico's courtroom theatrics and defiance couldn't save him from the crush of federal justice. His wife, Joyce Smoldono Persico, publicly defended him in a letter to a newspaper, claiming the government was inflicting excessive punishment on a man who just loved his family and home. Yet, the evidence of his sprawling, violent enterprise provided by informants was insurmountable. Sentenced to a staggering 139 years in prison for his racketeering and commission convictions, Persico effectively received a death sentence behind bars. But the Snake wasn't finished shedding his skin just yet. From a federal prison cell in California, he continued to ruthlessly manipulate the East Coast underworld, plotting to pass the scepter to his son, Alphonse Little Allyboy Persico, and unwittingly sparking a bloody internal war that would tear the Colombo family apart. Picture the scene: it's a balmy twilight on June 20, 1991, in the quiet, upscale suburb of Cedarhurst, Long Island. A man is driving home, anticipating a peaceful evening, when his survival instincts suddenly scream red alert. Parked directly across from his elegant 2-story house on Buckingham Road is a car with 4 men inside. Slamming on the brakes and pulling a wild U-turn, The driver floors it out of the neighborhood. He knows exactly who those men are, and he knows they are a hit squad sent to put a bullet in his head. The man fleeing for his life was Victor Little Vic Arena, and he wasn't just a wealthy suburbanite, he was the acting boss of the Colombo crime family. And the man who ordered the hit from 3,000 miles away in a federal penitentiary? None other than the official godfather himself, Carmine the Snake Persico. This was the spark that ignited one of the bloodiest and most sensational internal mob wars in New York history. Arena had been elevated to his acting position by Carmine's son, Alphonse Little Allyboy Persico, when the younger Persico went to prison in 1987. Little Vic was a stellar earner and a cautious operator who preferred the La Para Bianca, the white death where a victim's corpse is made to vanish without a trace. He even had his own finance consigliere, Dennis J. Pappas, laundering millions of dollars of illicit cash through a labyrinth of shell companies and bank accounts. But after 2 years of playing caretaker to an imprisoned boss, Arena got greedy and tired of the snake's remote-controlled dictatorship. Arena felt Persico was out of touch and was infuriated by rumors that Persico wanted to grandstand on television shows. Hungry for the official crown, Arena instructed the family's consigliere, Carmen Sessa, to pull the capos to see if they would support his bid to become the true boss. It was a fatal miscalculation. Sessa betrayed Arena, leaking the treacherous pull to Persico's loyalists. The snake's response from behind bars was swift and absolute: whack Arena. When Sessa and his hit team botched the June 20th ambush, the lines were drawn. After 3 tense months of failed sit-downs, all-out war erupted in November 1991. It was a bloody mismatch on paper. Arena commanded a massive faction of about 100 men, while Persico's loyalists numbered only 25 to 30. But what the Persico faction lacked in numbers, they made up for with one of the most terrifying and duplicitous figures in Mafia history, Gregory Scarpa. Scarpa was Persico's generalissimo, a ruthless enforcer who enthusiastically slaughtered Arena's soldiers. During one gruesome hit, as Scarpa blasted rounds into a dying victim's face, he triumphantly screamed, "This one's for Carmine." But here is the jaw-dropping twist that makes this story a true crime legend. For 30 years, this stone-cold killer had been living a double life as a top-echelon informant for the FBI. Operating through a super-secret hello phone with his handler, Special Agent Arlen Leland DeVecchio, Scarpa fed the feds a goldmine of intelligence on the Arena faction's illegal operations. While he betrayed Arena's gunmen and set them up for the FBI, Scarpa conveniently omitted any mention of his own active role as a triggerman in the war. He was essentially using the federal government to help win a mafia civil war. A federal judge later chastised DeVecchio and the FBI, describing Scarpa as sinister, violent, and manipulative. As the bodies piled up, the chaos handed federal prosecutors the ultimate weapon. The internal slaughter terrified the mobsters so much that many, including the treacherous consigliere Carmen Sessa, decided to flip and cooperate with the government to avoid getting killed or handed life sentences. Prosecutors like John Gleason and George Stamboulides used the mounting defections to obliterate the family's hierarchy. The war's climax came on April Fool's Day in 1992, when the feds finally cornered Victor Arena. The aspiring godfather was found hiding out in his mistress's home, surrounded by an apocalyptic arsenal of loaded shotguns, assault rifles, and handguns. Arena was convicted of RICO charges, murder, and loan sharking, and handed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, this treacherous power struggle decimated the Colombo family. The government indicted 68 capos, soldiers, and associates from both warring sides. Little Vic Arena's ambition to rule the underworld only guaranteed that he, his sons, and his top earners would spend the rest of their lives rotting in concrete cages, while the man he tried to overthrow, Carmine Persico, retained his blood-soaked crown from the confines of a California prison.